This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 9, Episode 5. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network of podcasts brought to you by KSG Armory Holsters. Today is Thursday, August 3rd, 2023, as of the recording of this episode. And I am your host, Riley Bowman. And of course, you see here along with me, co-host and producer extraordinaire, Matthew Marister.
I'm here with you, man. How you doing?
Great. Of course, if people were part of our pre-show conversation, they would find humor in me if I had introduced you as Matthew Big Brain Marister.
Yeah. Let's not go with that one because I can't live up to those expectations. So
Matthew was just telling me a minute ago how he's not paid to think, and I'm like, I don't know about that, dude. I don't know about that. Well, today we're glad to be with you all they're always a special episode. This special episode today, we're going to be talking about improving discipline in our shooting performance, or in other categories as well. We'll see where the conversation today, where it leads us. Today's episode is sponsored by LASR, or the Laser app. That stands for Laser Activated Shot Reporter software, available at laserapp.com, LASRAPP.com. And also, today's episode is sponsored by barrelblock.com. That's barrelblock, just with a K, BLOK, barrelblock.com. And also dryfireproshop.com. A relatively new endeavor, a one-stop shop for all your dry fire gear needs. Head on over to dryfireproshop.com. And what are we talking about again today? Improving discipline in your shooting. And this is inspired by the most recent Shooter Ready Challenge video that's published on shooterreadychallenge.com. Feel free to go over there when we're done with the podcast and view that video. Shooter Ready Challenge is intended to be a monthly dry fire oriented video series that hopefully inspires you, gives you ideas, tips, tricks, suggestions, and best practices related to conducting yourself in dry practice or dry fire practice. Because we want you to be doing dry fire, and we want you to succeed. And sometimes it's hard to even know what to do in dry fire. So fortunately, there's a whole library now of Shooter Ready. Oh, looks like I had a little bit of a connectivity issue there.
Was that you or me?
That was definitely me. I saw it pop up in the window saying that my Wi-Fi signal was weak, which is unfortunate because the router is like right on the other side of this wall.
Can't get it much closer.
I'm in a little bit of a different spot today than I normally am. But anyway, all right. So continuing on. So recently in Shooter Ready Challenge, we featured the Steel Challenge stage known as Accelerator. You've seen a couple of these over the last few months from us as we've been introducing these, rolling these out bit by bit, and try not to like dump all these on all of y'all at once. So trying to like mix these in along with some of the other ideas and things that we share on Shooter Ready Challenge. Accelerator is a fun one. Basically, if you're not familiar with Steel Challenge, just a quick overview, you always shoot 5 steel targets on every Steel Challenge stage, and they use different size targets, and they arrange them in different positions and different distances to create different shooting challenges. It's a really fun sport, frankly. A lot of people can get into Steel Challenge really easily because just about any gun you can find a place for in Steel Challenge. You can shoot Steel Challenge with 22 pistols, 22 rifles. The youngsters really enjoy that. Of course, you can use your standard, center fire, 9mm, 40s, even 45s if you wanted to, in various divisions in Steel Challenge. And there's also a PCC division as well. So, the only thing I think you can't really do is use a shotgun or a center fire rifle, or as far as like a high powered rifle. Okay. So again, you can use like a 9mm or even like a 45. I think caliber PCC if you wanted to. So lots of opportunities in Steel Challenge. You always shoot the five steel targets, and you can shoot them in any order you want, but there's going to be one of those that's identified as the stop plate, as they call it, or the stop target, and it's identified because it sits on a red pole or stand. So the red one is the one you end on. And so I like these because they're fun shooting challenges. They're relatively easy to set up, even if you don't have the fancy targets up on the wall like what you see me use in the Shooter Rated Challenge video. You can very easily mock these up yourself, and put up. You can take a piece of paper and draw targets on there, or Post-it note, and stick it up on the wall, and mock these up and create them yourselves. So easy to do, easy to set up, and it's good practice. Even if you're a defensive-oriented shooter, or that's the thing you're most passionate about, I think there's a lot of benefit gained from participating in Steel Challenge and other similar shooting sports, but also in just doing this kind of practice in dry fire, because the shooting challenges have carryover or crossover into other uses of guns as well. So today, though, we're talking about improving discipline in our shooting. And by that, the accelerator drill, really what it is it's like two different levels of throttle control as part of the same stage. So you've got a small target and a big target up close, and you have a small target and a big target far away. And then, of course, you have the stop plate, which is kind of in between those, and it's kind of a smaller target as well. And so you have have a target up close, or you have two targets up close, where one you could shoot pretty easily and pretty quickly because it's a pretty big target, and then you have one that's small. So whichever order you shoot that in, you can go fast and slow, or you can go slow then fast. Okay, and then the far targets, you've got, again, they're the exact same targets as what you have up close. So a small one and a big one. Again, one's going to be shot a little bit faster than the other one, actually quite a bit faster, most likely. So it's a fun challenge in that it's like, okay, I've got to throttle up then down up close, and I got to throttle up then down far away, or vice versa. Okay, whichever direction you want to shoot those. And so that creates, I think, a unique challenge. And I think one of the things that shooters struggle with the most on something like that, Matthew, is discipline. As far as it kind of becomes its own trap, where it sucks you into wanting to shoot things either too fast than what you're capable of, or taking too long, because that can happen too. That's usually less of the issue, but it can happen. So that's our focus today, talking about discipline, and I want to hear kind of your first thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and so you kind of mentioned on the Steel Challenge that we've covered other Steel Challenges before, and some of the elements are similar. You talked about kind of modulating your speed, or what you like to refer to it as throttle control, or that type of large targets, small targets, and now we're putting those large and small targets at distance and closer. So different sight pictures, right, for each one, and then so we also talked about transitioning from one target to another. So those are like elements that we have in many of these Steel Challenges, and oftentimes when we've talked about these specific elements of shooting individually on different podcasts before. So without rehashing all of that, I think the discipline aspect comes in. Like, and it's something that personally I struggle with continually. Something that I know my weaknesses is having enough, I guess, knowing how to shoot is different than actually applying what right? Like in the moment. So like I might know, hey, I need to take a more refined, I have to have a more refined sight picture and trigger press on a target that's smaller. I know that in my mind, but in the moment of shooting, I feel like the pressure to go faster, and I just came from a larger target that I didn't have to have as refined, of a process. Um, so now I transition to this instead of being disciplined enough to not only recognize it but control it, and make the right shot, or make the right um, trigger press necessary to get the hit. I go too quick, and so I think that's where the dry fire practice helps so much, because you can go through these iterations so many times through dry fire practice, and you don't get I at least when I'm running through dry fire, I don't get as discouraged as when I'm on the range, and you miss, and it's like, oh man, okay, you have to set it up and set the drill up, and all this stuff. But like when you're going through dry fire through like using something like LSR that records your shots and stuff, the process is so quick. You're like, okay, I messed that up, let me do it in 2 seconds. You're back to running it again, so you can get so many more iterations and so many more, like, I guess, like pictures in your mind of what that looks like, what it looked like when you had a good shot, and what it looked like when you rushed it. And so I think the process of like smoothing that out becomes, and obviously you have to confirm all this through live fire, not just saying just dry fire, but the practice of dry fire, I think, is really important in this aspect of like trying to become disciplined, in not only, telling somebody how to do something and them saying, yeah, I get it, and then actually performing that are two different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're exactly where I'm at on this, in that, like you said, something about, shooting and understanding the concept or whatever, like being able to do it in just practice is one thing. But then anytime there's a little bit of pressure or stress, or you feel like you got to, get it done, like there's a sense of urgency, if you will, that it's really easy that for those well, number one, for those skills to fall apart, and especially for this idea of discipline to start to fall apart as well.
Mm.
We see examples of that all the time. In fact, so recently I saw an officer involved shooting where he was engaging his threat from somewhere around 25 yards. I'd say honestly, like it's hard to know exactly what the distance was, but 20, probably 25 yards is a pretty good number. It might have been 20, but it might have been as much as 30. But in the end, it's not all that dissimilar. 20 is a pretty good distance for pistol shooting, especially at a with a sense of urgency. 30 is definitely pretty challenging too. So and he ended up shooting more than I think a magazine worth of ammo during the course of this engagement, and only connected like one or two shots, and a lot of the shots fired, I mean, were very obviously, I mean, it's basically just mag dumping. It's like, oh, threat, pop, 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 and I'm just gonna keep sending rounds until he stops,
Mhm.
and like, okay, basically accuracy by volume, right? Like I could send it, if I send enough rounds that direction, eventually something's got to connect, right? Kind of thinking. And so, I'm not trying to like blame this cop or be, too judgmental or harsh on him, because cops have a tough job. Certainly there are examples of poor cops out there, and I'm not saying this one is one. I'm just saying it's a tough job. This might be your first shooting that you've ever been involved in. You might not know what to expect, and all of a sudden you're called upon to do something that you've not had to do before, and that's a that's a big test right there. Is like, oh, all of a sudden these skills matter. All of a sudden I have to deal with this problem. And so what I'm saying, reason I'm bringing this all up is I don't know what the actual, say, shooting skill of this officer is. I mean, I think I have kind of an idea based on what I could see from the officer's point of view, body worn camera. But uh, but honestly, the actual skill level is, I mean, certainly it matters, but it's irrelevant in the context of what we're trying to discuss here. What I can tell you is that from the results, meaning like 1 or 2 hits out of like 20 rounds or something fired, um, suggests that there was a lack of discipline in shooting there.
Mhm.
Okay. And there's reasons for that. Okay. Because whoa, the severity, the criticalness, of the criticality, if you will, of this event, like, calls for immediate action, and there's a lot of pressure to get that done, right?
Mhm.
But that's, again, like you touched on it. Sometimes, it's, hey, doing it is one thing, doing it in practice is another thing, but then having pressure put on you and being able to hold yourself to a certain performance standard, it's hard to do, and that's why discipline is important. That's why we're talking about it here today.
Yeah, and I think like in anything we do, whether whatever anything we're trying to learn, whether it's like a physical skill or you know, um, discipline, I think is just like we have it's trying to get our I guess um, prepare ourselves in some sort of principle or habit, and then being able to apply that when it's necessary is like the application part of that. But like, I think and we don't have to go off on this, but I just wanted to touch on like discipline as like yes, there's a discipline in the process of shooting that we're kind of talking about, but there's also a discipline in like that you're actually practicing and getting and building those skills, right? Like, so there has to be a discipline in how you practice and how you train and those types of things so that you can develop those skills. Because I mean, granted, probably a lot of the people that are listening to the show enjoy shooting to some degree. They enjoy the process, they enjoy firearms in general, but they actually like shooting. um, there's probably some people that carry a firearm that are like, I'm not a big, I don't like to shoot that much, but I see the value in having a firearm to protect myself. So for those people, going out to the range and shooting, it might require some discipline, right? Of like, hey, I'm going to do this even though I don't really want to do this, or it's not enjoyable. Or, for people that like to go shoot, they might go out to the range once a month or twice a month, or, you know, but not everybody is in that boat. So like, I think, we're talking about discipline and improving your shooting. And I think that it might even start earlier than that. Like, hey, I need some discipline in how I train. And maybe we go back even further and say, I need some discipline in disciplining myself to actually carry a firearm on a daily basis, if that's what I'm going to do for self-defense. Like so there's these processes that we go through and these things that we do to kind of build ourselves up to be able to perform a certain level or to be able to do something. And I think we're talking specifically about maybe the discipline in applying your skills in a specific incident. But it certainly could be applied to training in general, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk. I think there's two things we could address here. One is talking about what discipline in, say, your sight picture needs to look like, or what that looks like. And then we could probably also address ways or strategies or tips for how to develop greater discipline in our practice, so that it carries over into real world performance. And so let's start first by talking about what that looks like. I think that's it. I think that's relevant to address and to talk about. So hopefully people can start trying to emulate this or do this in practice. But first, I do need to do a quick episode or sponsor spot, which our first sponsor today is laserapp.com. Is the website. Laser App is the software we've been using for years now in our personal dry fire practice. I know Matthew's familiar with it. I use it Jacob uses it. A lot of the guys on our team use the Laser app software, and we feature it, specifically the Laser X version of the software, in our monthly Shoot Array Challenge drill videos, and show. I mean, a part of that's not only showing people like the drill, but also kind of showing like this is how you can set it up, and this is what you can do in the software, and this is the kind of things that you can measure. And I think part of developing discipline, Matthew, is actually being able to measure your performance and
Mhm.
knowing what you can and cannot do. So I'm going to come back to that and talk and explore that a little bit more. But to conclude my episode sponsor spot here for a Laser app, guys, check them out. I think it's worth every penny you pay. I think it is a valuable dry fire tool because of that aspect that you can measure very precisely your performance in dry fire practice, which is something that's normally and traditionally kind of hard to do. Before anything like this existed, you had to just pretty much rely on yourself to be honest with yourself, and you could use a shot timer with par times set, and but then you're still like, hey, did I get that drill thing done, or the draw done, or the trigger press, or whatever done before that second beep? Sometimes it's hard to know. Certainly, it's hard to know with any degree of precision. And so I think it's great to at least consider checking out Laser app software today. Go to laserapp.com and consider signing up or downloading the software. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, a part of, I think, developing discipline, um, maybe I said we were going to talk about what discipline in your sight picture looks like. Um, but let me go here first, and then
Hmm.
maybe we'll go in reverse order what I said a little while ago. Part of developing discipline especially in practice, is in measuring your performance. And when I say, anytime I say performance, and I like, some guys I think probably hear performance in shooting, and like their brain switched off because they think that's like a competition term. Performance is performance, bro. If you
Mhm.
got, if you are shooting competition or training for competition, yeah, that's evident. It's a performance sport. If you are concerned about your performance in a self-defense encounter, yeah, that's performance. And yes, there is a shot timer involved. You just don't know what the par time is,
Mhm.
because the par time is undetermined, and the par time is whenever your opponent ends up putting you out of the fight, right? So it is a performance. It's a performance endeavor, no matter which way, which side of the house you primarily reside on. Uh, and so it's important, I think, to measure performance when you're practicing. And here's why. And I think this is what helps actually us establish some basis for discipline and allows us to hold ourselves accountable to that. Because if we don't measure what we can do, then we don't know what our limits are. And if we don't know what our limits are, it's hard uh, to establish criteria, or almost like algorithms, if you will, like formulas, uh, that that keep you, operating within those parameters, right? That can kind of give you this, because in the moment when you have a shooting problem present itself, um, you, I mean, there's a certain set of parameters that you need to fall within in terms of your performance, because either you're too slow or you outrun your headlights, right? And that happens be a lot of times, I think, with shooters, because they just don't know where their limits are. And so it's imperative, it's incumbent upon you and all of us, if you care enough about performing well under stress, especially, you need to know where your limits are. You need to know where the wheels fall off at. You need to know what you can get away with and what you cannot. Because if you do not know that, then I mean, you're pulling it out of your butt. I'm
Mhm.
sorry to say, like, you just, yeah. I mean, we see it time and time again, time and time again. And so we can modulate our output, meaning I can ramp up speed, ramp down speed, while still hitting the targets I need to, based on target difficulty. Because I mean, there's strategies for doing that, and we'll talk here in a bit about what that should look like. But if you don't know what your limits are, that's hard to do
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because you have like no context for where the limits are at, and so it becomes very easy for you to push beyond those, and that's how you end up like that officer involved shooting I mentioned a bit ago, where all of a sudden you're shooting way faster than what you're capable of based on that particular target difficulty.
Yeah, and I think quantifying one of the things that you could do to improve, your improve in the way you practice and the way you dry fire and the way you develop skill is to quantify. And we've talked about this before, but quantifying those times, and we're not talking about like we've gotten down to where it says, hey, where we said like, hey, these times are generally like, the average time for a concealed carrier, and this is what this is the amount of time it takes for somebody who, a threat who's facing away from you to turn around and recognize it. So like this is how long it would take you to, you would need a draw speed of this time to solve this this problem of this person facing away, and this is how much time. But like in general, knowing your capabilities allows you to, by quantifying through dry fire and through knowing how long does it take me to get, draw to first shot, how do I transition, how long does it take me to, transition between these two targets in distances and sizes, and get accurate shots, and what's a normal time. And then you add, okay, if I'm under stress or this is under perfect circumstances and I've been going through 15 iterations and kind of my time's been coming down gradually. Well, you can't just take your best time and be like, well, that's my performance, because that's not how you're probably going to perform cold, when the when you're walking down the street or whatever. So we understand that. And then so when we start to look at these problems, and I've always done this in my mind, and I know a lot of you guys and gals that listen, like you what if scenario things, and you see scenarios, you're standing in line somewhere and you're looking, you're like, okay, if this guy did this, and where would I go, and these are my positions of cover, and this is so. You have to have an idea of your performance, because if not, then you have this idea like you're John Wick and you're what if scenarioing, and you're like, well, if this happens, I'm going to roll and dive behind this trash can and come up one-handed and shoot, and I'll grab it, and it's like, no, like you can't, you have to know your capability, so you know what you can perform like, and then use that actual performance in however you're looking at, the world around you. And I think that you'll end up realizing your deficiencies if you do it that way, and it'll kind of drive you to train a little bit more. And I think that's where a lot of times we overestimate our abilities, and then we don't train or we don't practice enough, because we're like, I know I can hit this target at 20 yards and it's not a big deal. But then when you actually try to do it, it's like maybe you're doing it 6 out of 10 times. Well, that's okay on the range, but not when your life's at stake or whatnot. So I don't know. I think that
if it's only 6 out of 10 times, it's not a dependable skill yet.
Right. It's 60%. So, and so,
I mean, in baseball, that's passable.
Well, yeah,
that's a great batting average.
but like, not when you're trying to defend your life. So, but yeah, so I think all these things like discipline in actually quantifying, and sometimes it's hard for us to do because we don't want to quantify it, because that means like maybe what the numbers are saying or what's actually our performance isn't exactly what we think it is or what we think we are, and we can go two ways. We can look at it and say, well, I'm not going to do that. That's not for me. I know what my skills are and the time I'm going to rise to the occasion or whatnot. Or we can say, okay, let me work on this and get to this next level or performance level. And I think it can help discipline us in getting to those levels we set benchmarks and goals, and we can reach those things.
Yeah, I really like what you said there. And I'll just add to that before we move on to the next thing a little bit. That one of the reasons why developing discipline in your shooting, which, as I described a minute ago, part of being able to do that is learning where your limits are, and kind of knowing who you are, like what you're capable of skill wise as a shooter, is because that also helps reinforce being a little bit more disciplined uh, in the decision making department as well. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, if you have good knowledge, like really solid, truth like knowledge of who you are as a person, as a shooter, as far as what your skills are, meaning what you like, you have a distinct understanding of what you can and cannot do skill wise, then that also helps feed into the more decision making side of the equation, which becomes very relevant in a self defense context, right? Because, I mean, Matthew, I'm sure you've met some of these guys and gals. I've met some people too that handle themselves very well out on the streets, whether as police officers or whatever, because they're very confident in who they are. And they don't even necessarily have to be the most skilled people, but but they know who they are as a person. They know what they can and cannot do. And that gives a person a certain level of confidence. And so then you're a lot better able to make wise decisions for you in situations you encounter because you know what you can and cannot do. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to make a decision that gets you in trouble, that puts because it puts you in a place, in a bad place, that all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this, I'm in over my head now. Like, you're not going to end up in that kind of situation because you don't allow it to occur in the first place, because you understand your limitations. Okay. Meanwhile, if it also reinforces making good, sound, tactical decisions and choices as far as when to engage, with an adversary, because you, especially we're in the self-defense context, where or we're always playing the reactionary game, meaning that we we don't get to draw first blood necessarily. I mean, like, we might draw technical first blood, so don't read into that too critically, but it's always a game of defense, right? It's not one of offense, meaning that I don't use deadly force, or I don't really use force of any kind, period, unless there is a provocation and there's a justification, something that the other party does that provides that justification, right? That says, okay, now I'm justified in using force, particularly deadly force, right? And so in other words, we always need to be a little bit reluctant to use force, right? And if I understand my limits really well and I have confidence in that, then I can allow things to maybe go a bit further. And I know it sounds maybe scary to some people, but some people have gotten involved in incidents that they shouldn't have, because they got involved too soon, right? And they went too far, meaning it was an overuse of force, or they used force where maybe wasn't, like, maybe it was kind of a gray area. And then by the time it all sorts itself out and you go to trial or whatever, and like you're on the wrong side of the law, right? But if you have a greater level of skill, and more importantly, you know where your limits are, then you're a lot more confident in not engaging in a situation unless you absolutely know that you need to, and you know how you have the skill to deal with it. And then
Mm-hmm.
obviously, if you know that something is outside of your abilities, then, well, what's your choice? You better get away. You
Mm-hmm.
better run.
Yeah.
Right? And then that's sometimes the decision that has to be made. So this is why I think um, promoting discipline in shooting requires learning who you are as a shooter. That requires measurement of performance and skill and ability, which reinforces your knowledge in yourself and your confidence, and allows you to make better, smarter, uh, tactical decisions in the real world.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. I think a couple times. Mentioning one that bring is coming to mind is when we talked about automaticity, and like developing the technical skills to shoot is important. It absolutely is, but it's not the end all be all of surviving a tactical situation or a deadly force situation. You can be the best shooter in the world, but if you don't understand how to apply those skills in a real world environment, well, then you may not survive. And conversely, you might be a really good tactician, and that might, set you up and you might be able to avoid situations. But once you get in there, if you can't avoid it and you have no pistol skills or no fighting skills, or then how are you can't deploy the tool that you have appropriately. So it's like that automaticity of knowing your skills, having them to the level where when we go through that kind of a curve and say, hey, the skill set at this running rate drills at this level, at this standard, suggests some automaticity, suggests that you don't really have to think technically about all these trigger press from this target to this target. Like I kind of those kind of things are somewhat programmed. I don't need to think about my draw or clear my cover garment. If you can get to that level, then when these problems present themselves, then you can observe the scenario in a bigger, wider scope and say, okay, there's cover here, or I need to move to this side of the car, or what's my backdrop? I can't take, I need to move because there's people right behind here. If I move off to the side, now I have a better view, or whatever it might be. So it allows you, like you said, to have a better solution to the problem. And it might be a shooting solution. It might be, I'm just moving to cover, and that might be the solution. That might be the actual better solution. And so I think these skills, knowing your skills, getting it to a level where it's, there suggests some automaticity in these skills, and then being able to understand your skills and apply it in a real world situation gives you the best opportunity, or statistically odds, or however you want to put it, of surviving multiple different types of scenarios that you might face in a defensive gun use.
Yeah, spot on. Before we move to the next thing, I want to mention real quick today's episode sponsor being one of them being barrelblock.com. A moment ago, listener or viewer Randy on Facebook asked about setting up a safe dry fire spot in his apartment. And he's like, well, no direction seems good if I'm sticking to strict barrel pointing best practices, is what his comment here reads. And my response was, we covered that actually in the setting up at your dry fire dojo episode just a couple episodes ago, season 9, episode 2. And I was just thinking that's perfect segue as well for our Barrel Block sponsorship today, because if you live in an apartment and you don't have a safe direction, then you absolutely need to be using a barrel block in dry practice. We did talk about some strategies and ways of identifying where would be the best direction possible in an apartment type situation. But here's the thing: use a barrel block, completely block that chamber and barrel, prevent that gun from being able to even chamber around, let alone fire around, make it completely, at least as long as that barrel block's installed, inert. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I would say for you, Randy. But hey, guys, barrel block's a great product for any of us in dry practice, because you cannot have a mistake as long as it's installed,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one, how many times we see stories pop up, Matthew, where it's like, well, I was trying to, do some dry fire, and I accidentally put a hole in my wall, or I put a hole in my TV, or I put a hole in my fridge. That was one. That was fun. And so, yeah, no, those wouldn't have happened. Number one, if we followed safe handling practices, but number two, had a barrel block installed. So why not have that extra peace of mind? Go to barrelblock.com. That's barrelblock with a K.com. Those of you watching the video, there it is on the screen. Okay, so let's talk. We have just a little bit of time remaining for our episode today. What does disciplined shooting look like in actually doing it? it, what I'd really like to hit on here, Matthew, if it's not clear, is what do you actually, I mean, think of in context of this accelerator still challenge stage, right? The way that I think most people shoot it, there's a couple of ways, but I think the way I've seen most do it is they'll draw to the target on the far left target, which is a round plate. It's like 10 inches or something in diameter.
Hmm.
And then they go to the next target to its immediate right, which is a 18-inch by 24-inch rectangle. It's pretty big. It's a lot bigger than that circle that you start on. And then they'll go to the far right, which is another 18 by 24-inch plate that's a lot further distance. I can't remember the exact distances on this. I could have looked it up.
It's
And
60. I got it pulled up. It's the back targets are 60 feet.
so that's 20 yards.
Mm-hmm.
And the closest ones are what, 7 or 10? 10 probably.
30 feet.
10 yards. Yep.
Yep.
So you're going 10 yards and then you're going 20 yards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going hard right to the big plate, and then they'll come back towards the middle because the stop plate's in the middle. So they'll go big plate at the hard right, then the smaller circle, and then the stop plate in the middle. So basically you go far left, then the next left, then you go far right, then the next right, and then middle. Okay, in that order. That's generally how I've seen this done. That's how I shoot the stage. What do you need to actually see with a shooting challenge like that, where we have throttle control in like sort of two different levels, two different depths, same targets, same relational size, but now we test ourselves on throttle control up close, and then we test ourselves on throttle control far away. What do we need to see? What does that look like? I'd like to hear your thoughts first.
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at this, and so like so the smaller target, if we need to get a hit on a smaller target, whether that target is the same size target and just moved further away, which makes it smaller by nature visually, or it's actually physically smaller, it's really the same thing. It's so you're looking, you get that sight picture, and then based on the size of the target, size, what I'm not saying, a 6-inch plate, because a 6-inch plate at 25 feet is different than a 6-inch plate at 6 feet. Like it looks different. So what you're seeing, what you actually see with that sight picture, then you say, okay, in order for me to get a hit, I need to, I need a specific trigger press that is acceptable at this size, right? And then if you move too quick, then you have the potential to miss. The other side of that is I have a larger target, and I use that same sight picture and trigger press for the larger target. And that's not necessarily a good thing either if speed is important, because now you're taking too much time on a target that you don't need to have that much of a refined picture. So I think the discipline comes by knowledge of what do I need on this end and what do I need on this end, and then using the appropriate sight picture and trigger press for the target. Not I have this one sight alignment and trigger press for every solution, and so for me to get a hit on a small target, I have to go really slow, and I might as well use that same thing for this other target that's really large. And so there's no discernment or so I don't know if that answers the question, but like I don't know.
No, I think that's a great answer. I think it's a great place to start, especially. I know we're running out of time, and folks, if you didn't know, Matthew's got a hard stop here coming up. So let me throw at you one more thing, and this is my approach with this. And so I call it my stoplight analogy. If you've taken our shooting fundamentals course on Guardian University, I explain this concept in that course. This is something I teach in my pistol intelligence course. The idea is that you need to learn to use appropriate sight pictures, or sight movies, as my friend Tim Herron likes to call them, based on relative difficulty or size of target. Okay. And so the stoplight analogy is that some targets, or certain sight pictures are going to be like a green light, some are a yellow light, and some are a red light. Let me start with red light, actually. It's really simple to explain a red one. What I need to see with a sight picture that is described as a red light sight picture or red light target is that I got to see things, if I'm shooting irons, I got to see things lined up perfectly, equal height, equal light sort of stuff. And I need to see that relatively settled, meaning it's holding steady on the center of that target, of that difficult target. That's a red light target. Okay. So the smaller plate at 20 yards, in the case of this Steel Challenge drill accelerator, you need to see, if you're shooting irons, equal height, equal light, centered on the center of that round target. If you're shooting a red dot, you need to see an actual dot, not a streak or a flash of it, but a dot, settled and holding steady over the middle of that steel target. That smaller one at 20 yards. That's what you're going to need to see to hit that reliably at that distance. Now, the target next to that is that 18 by 24 inch plate at 20 yards. That's a lot bigger and a lot more generous. So that's what I would call a yellow light target. And what that is, I like to describe it as a floating sight picture, which I think is terminology that Max Michel I first heard use. And I like that, meaning that I don't need to get things perfectly aligned and perfectly still. But it needs to be in there. So in the case of a red dot on that 18 by 24 inch plate at 20 yards, man, as soon as that dot's in there, send it. I don't have to get it perfectly still. And I don't want to have too much erratic behavior, like super, like very. That's what I see on a green light target. But it kind of needs to flow in there. As long as the dot's within the surface area of that target, then I'm probably good to send it. I mean, I want to be on the center more or less. But if I see that dot in there, send it. In the case of irons, they don't have to be perfectly aligned, and they don't have to be holding perfectly steady on the target either. But they need to be they just can't be too misaligned or too crazy. That's the harder one. The yellow range is the more difficult one of these two concepts. Green light is that big target up close at 10 yards. It really doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, you could basically just superimpose your gun, the silhouette or the shape of your gun or your optic over top of that steel plate at 10 yards and send it, because it's relatively close and it's a really big target. You don't require a lot of aiming confirmation to accomplish that shot. And that's what's unique about the shooting challenge and accelerator. The big one is definitely a green light up close. The smaller one is the close one. The close circle is more like a yellow. Caution. That means slow things down a little bit, see a little bit more, exercise a little caution, get things reasonably aligned and reasonably on the target, send it. Okay, same thing on the big target at the far distance, but then that smaller one, that's a red light for sure. So wish I had more time to go. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit before as well, and I'll give you a couple other podcast episodes of ours where some of these concepts are definitely talked about and sometimes in greater depth. Season 8, episode 15 with Charlie Perez, called Aiming Solutions with Charlie Perez. We just had that a couple of months ago. Another good episode where some of this is touched on was actually 2 episodes with Tim Herron, where we talked about iron sights or red dots. That's season 7, episodes 16, part 1 and part 2. And then also, I think we even touched a little bit on this on, where was it? I had it here. Season 7, episode 21, transitions on single value targets. So you guys can go reference those episodes for additional context and information on this topic. So we're probably out of time, aren't we?
Well, we got a couple more minutes. I know we're getting close to the end, but yeah, I agree totally, and I think we've covered it, and we don't need to belabor it. But that's where the discipline comes in, right? Like we can tell somebody that, and they can nod their head and say, "Yep, I get it." But actually having the discipline in the moment to recognize it and to slow down or to speed up. Even like some people, they shoot too methodically, right? And you're like, you can go faster. I mean, I guess that might be a better solution in some aspects, but it can go both ways. And so it's like in the moment, and when you tell somebody, hey, you had tons more time, you could have, you just went too quickly. If you just would have dialed it back, like, one little 10%, you would have been in, and you would have only probably maybe it would have been half a second more. But you try to go too quick and you missed. And so it's like, that's where the discipline, and that's where knowing your abilities and practicing comes. I think that's probably the only way that you actually develop that ability, is through repetition and knowledge of yourself and your abilities, and seeing it over and over and over, and then kind of ingraining it in your mind of like, I recognize that's something I recognize.
It is something that requires numerous exposures, meaning that you set up targets of different difficulties at different distances and sort of experiment with what you have to see sight picture wise, and then what you can also kind of get away with too, and still get acceptable hits. And you sort of start building this mental, cognitive database of, based on this relative size of target at, whatever distance, this is what I need to see, or I'm not going to hit it, right? Your example a moment ago of people going too slow. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Going too slow, that person is the person that, with respect to this shooting drill we're talking about today, accelerator in steel challenge. So a 18-inch by 24-inch steel plate at 10 yards is massive. A hit anywhere on that scores the same as one in the dead center. That's a huge target area, even at 10 yards. Okay. A person going too slow is the person that's making sure they don't send a shot until they see perfect sight alignment, holding still on that target. Not required. Okay. If you're shooting irons, chances are all I got to do is just happen to see that my front sight's somewhere on that target, and that's probably good enough, regardless of where that rear sight is. I mean, obviously I could have things really misaligned, but if you have reasonably good fundamentals and mechanics and grip and all that, like as soon as I see front sight on that thing, man, press trigger. Okay. Because if you're waiting to see a perfect sight picture on that big of a target that close, then you are shooting too slow. The flip side of that, the person that is shooting too fast is the person that has a lot of misses, and that's the person that treats a yellow target or a red target like a green one, meaning they're like, oh, I see my front sight, and they're shooting that target at 20 yards. Not good enough alignment. Need to see a little more, okay, to get a good hit. But they're like, oh, I see my front sight, send it, or in the case of a red dot, they see a flash of red kind of on the target, and they're like, yeah, send it, but it's just a flash. Instead, they need to see it kind of float in there a little bit. Yeah, different sight pictures for different target, and I always like to think in terms of relative size. And you learn this too with practice, right? If I'm shooting certain iron sights, as I shoot targets, I learn that, hey, when a target relative to my sight look, for instance, 7-yard A zone, right? Front sight is well within that. Well within. Like the A zone swallows my front sight, right? It probably my rear sight might be kind of like, depending on the actual, it's going to vary from gun to gun and actual sight to sight, right? But depending on some of my guns, an A zone is almost the exact width of my rear sight. Okay. Like, just looking at the relative size comparisons, right? But you got a target like that, a USPSA A zone of 7 yards, man, front sight just needs to be in there somewhere. Chances are it's going to connect, right? But now I shoot that same A zone at 25. Now that front sight is about as big as the A zone. You see what I mean? And so you kind of learn this, like I said, you build this database of like visual information. And so when you transition to a target, you can start to quickly gauge that, oh, my sights are fitting within that target area. So how much alignment's really necessary? Or, ooh, that target's starting to look pretty small compared to my sight. So now I got to really make sure things get lined up and centered over the target area. Or in the case of a dot, I like running 6 MOA dots. 6 MOA dot at 25 yards is 1.5 inches relative size. If I'm shooting A zones, I don't have to have it like super perfect still, but I got to see it pretty clearly. And certainly I've had shots. We had a match just a month or two ago where we had to make a head A box hit at 25 yards. Yeah, that now that dot barely fits within that head A box. And so what do I got to see? I got to stop, pause, see a perfectly clear dot, center right in that zone, super careful, trigger press, bam, right? It's very different than that dot. I mean, it's completely engulfed, completely swallowed by that A zone at 7 yards, right? And so as soon as I see any like flash of red in there, wow, send it, bah, bah, bah. You know what I mean? So develop, again, learn your limits, develop the discipline to hold yourself to those limits. And even when the stress comes, you have to just go, hey, I know that I feel this urge to go fast, or I'm feeling this pressure, but I got to hold myself to the process. And the process here is I have to see what I need to see to make this hit count.
Right on.
Final words?
I don't want to add anything to it, because that's a good conclusion, man. Yeah, just put the work in, guys. Like that's really all that it boils down to is you can't get better if you don't put the work in. So
Yep. Both in live fire and dry fire. And
Yep.
we're primarily talking about, with respect to Shooter A Challenge videos from dry fire context, you can reinforce everything we just talked about in dry practice.
Mhm.
Absolutely. You can set up scaled targets in your home, in your garage, in your shops, wherever it is you do dry fire. You can set up scaled targets so you can start reinforcing these concepts of what do I need to see based on the size of my gun and sight relative to the target I'm engaging to get the appropriate sight picture based on that target difficulty. So let it start in dry practice and carry it over to live fire. Speaking of dry practice, before we let you go, final episode sponsor today, dryfireproshop.com, relatively new sponsor of the show and relatively new business venture. We've sold dry fire products on concealedcarry.com and some of our other websites for a number of years now, but we decided to create a whole new home for these products. Anything dry fire related, we are adding to dryfireproshop.com. And so if you are in a position where you're like, man, I need some dry fire gear, I want to get a barrel block. I mean, you can go to barrelblock.com. I want some dummy rounds. I want some, I don't know, whatever, whatever you're using dry fire. Brains fried right now. Anything you need dry fire related, we're putting it up on dryfireproshop.com. One-stop shop. Pick up your gear, get to work, get to practice in dry fire. And if there's something that you'd like to see on dryfireproshop.com, let us know. We'll try to make sure we get those products up there. Appreciate you guys supporting our sponsors. Today's episode sponsors were laserapp.com, barrelblock.com, and again, we just mentioned dryfireproshop.com. And that's all time we have for today. Thanks, guys, for being a part of this episode. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, sir.
So, guys, until next time, a reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.